Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So here I have a rapier and a small sword. And a question that sometimes comes up in the discussion of historical fencing and its evolution, to use that word, which I know is much hated by many people who like swords and fencing because it leads to lots of preconceptions, and I'll talk about that in a minute, is the question of, is a small sword better than a rapier, or is a rapier in fact a better weapon? Well, of course, before I say anything else, I should say context is everything. Okay, context. The context that a rapier was intended to be used in, or the contexts, is not the same really as the contexts that a small sword was intended to be used in. So just saying which is a better sword is too simplistic of a question to really give a very useful answer. But let's look at them compared. So first of all, the rapier in general is much longer. Now, what I should say at the very beginning of this is that, yes, the rapier did evolve, or did transition and change in much of Europe into the small sword. This is an 18th century small sword, and this is a reconstruction of a 17th century rapier. So in the, let's say at the beginning of the 17th century, the rapier was the predominant gentleman's weapon, and it was used for dueling, but it was also carried on the battlefield. The small sword evolved out of a certain set of types of rapier that transitioned into more and more, I would say, more and more of a specialised dueling weapon. And the end result, by the end of the 17th century, or the late part of the 17th century, let's say the kind of 1680s, 1690s, was a small sword. And by about 1690, we have small swords that look really quite similar to what I'm holding here. So amazingly, you know, from, say, this is dated to about 1640, this rapier, and this is this small sword is probably about 1720. So there's almost 100 years separating these weapons, but in that period of time these gave way to these. Now the small sword, whilst it was carried as a sidearm and was carried for self-protection and was carried by military officers in some situations, especially this kolishmad style of small sword that I'm holding, it was nevertheless, I would argue, a specialised dueling weapon, and I've spoken about this in previous videos, and I will talk more specifically about this kolishmad small sword in a video quite soon, I think. But fundamentally, the rapier is a bigger, heavier weapon, much heavier. Okay, this small sword only weighs somewhere in the region of 400 grams. Okay, it's less than 400 grams. It's very, very light. Whereas the rapier weighs 1300 grams. Now, because of the added length and weight and hand protection of the rapier is able to do a lot greater number of, fulfill a greater number of roles than the small sword is. The rapier can go against you know, back swords and long swords and falchions on pretty much equal terms. In fact, some would say more than equal terms, and I might be one of those people. And the rapier can indeed deal with polearms. It can oppose halberds and partisans and glaives and other weapons of the time. It is a pretty fearsome weapon that can essentially be used in almost all contexts of its day, of the late 16th and 17th centuries. Whereas the small sword, whilst it was carried in many contexts, is really a specialised dueling weapon. It's so light and so fragile. Look at the handguard. There's not very much there to protect your hand. That knuckle bow is not going to take a very heavy blow from something like a clubbed musket or a blow from a backsword, whereas that handguard absolutely definitely will. So the rapier is fulfilling far more roles. Now, what some people assert, and some people especially who've read fencing histories written by sport fencers who don't know very much about fencing history, in other words the people who haven't studied the treatises, haven't studied very much history, but they have studied what other fencing authors have written in the last 100 years, will say, ah, well, you know, the small sword is the sort of apex of development, and it's a superior weapon to the rapier. And this, of course, is a completely idiotic, so idiotic. If anybody sits down and just thinks about that statement for more than about 30 seconds, they realise they're a complete idiot for saying it, because of course it's nonsensical. It doesn't mean anything at all. All it means is that the small sword is more specialised to the duel. Now, ironically, that does not mean that a small sword is better in a duel than a rapier. If we actually have one duelist with a rapier and one duelist with a small sword, I will put my money on the rapierist pretty much every time. Now, that's not to say that if you have a small sword you can't beat a rapierist. A really good small sworder can beat a really bad rapierist, and there is essentially two advantages that the small sword has. One advantage is speed. It's incredibly light, okay, so it's very, very quick and very, very easy to wield because it's so light. And the second advantage is having a shorter blade means that in the bind you often have a greater amount of leverage, because the point of contact is very often closer to the small sworder's hand than it is to the rapierist's hand, okay, because the rapierist is trying to manage a longer blade. So essentially the rapier, its shortness, which is usually a disadvantage, and I would say overall is a disadvantage, can be an advantage when it comes to disengaging and binding strength. And of course it's part and parcel of the fact that it's lighter as well, so it can move around quicker. The rapier, on the other hand, has all the other advantages in a direct encounter. It has a greater length blade, it can cut as well as thrust, it's a heavier weapon, so in the bind it has a bit of weight behind it. It has better hand protection, at least against other types of weapons. But really it's about length. It's very, very difficult if you have two people who are equally skilled and equally experienced. It's very difficult for the person who's only using a 30-inch blade against the person who's using a 40-inch blade, because every single time you try and advance on them you're having to deal with their cuts and thrusts, whereas you can't reach them yet. So you have about 10 inches of distance where they can do things to you and you can't really do anything to them directly. You can only try and oppose their blade or defend from their blade. Equally, on a quite simplistic point of view, as you can see here as I'm holding the weapons up, the small sworder's hand is vulnerable, very vulnerable, especially because you don't have very much hand protection on a small sword, to attacks from the rapier at a distance where the rapierist's hand is completely immune to attacks from the small sword, because not only can the small sword only thrust, it can't cut, but it can't reach the rapierist's hand at that distance. So I would say the rapier really has 90% of the advantages. But to reiterate, a good small sworder can beat a rapierist. So you might say, if the small sword was an inferior weapon to the rapier, if the small sword was inferior, opposed to the rapier, why was it carried? Well, you've got to remember that it was a specialised duelling weapon. And in a duel, both people, assuming it's an official duel, both people have matched weapons. Both people would have small swords. If we've both got small swords, then the relative lack of hand protection, the short blade, all of these things, the fact it can't cut, are not a disadvantage, because both people have the same advantages and the same disadvantages. So why did small swords start to be carried rather than rapiers? Well, we have to remember that in the period when rapiers were carried, in quite a lot of Europe in war, people would take off their rapiers and put on backswords and scivonas and broadswords and other types of sort of battlefield sword. People who carried rapiers would carry these in civilian life and would carry another sword in military life. So first of all, if we're only carrying this in civilian life and we're going to fence, and therefore it's a weapon showing our kind of manhood and our status and our willingness to face someone with a sword for a matter of honour, then if everybody switches to using shorter, lighter swords, nobody's at a disadvantage. Okay, so if there's a gradual shift towards small swords, there's never this kind of natural selection thing of, oh, but a rapier is a better sword in a duel, because we're going to use similar weapons. So I do think part of it was simply a move towards something that was more convenient to carry around, because the vast majority of people who carried and wore swords never actually used them. never actually used them in anger anyway. They might have used them in fencing practice. But the vast majority of people who wore a sword that announced that they were willing to duel didn't actually duel. They never actually had a duel. So if you spend 99.99999% of the time only wearing a sword, you may as well wear something that's shorter and lighter and easier to wear. So I do think convenience plays a part in the small sword's adoption over the rapier. Some people might argue, and in fact there are historical treatises that argue, that in a duel a small sword is advantageous over the rapier. I don't really hold with that. I think that was people who were championing the small sword, trying to say, hey look, if you come against someone who's using an old school rapier, for example in Spain they were still using cup hilt rapiers, if you come up against a Spanish person with a cup hilt, you can still beat them, don't worry, you'll be okay. And I think that was really a confidence builder. I think by and large you're at a big disadvantage if you have a shorter blade and a smaller hilt. It seems a no-brainer to me. So, you know, the shift really, I think, from rapier to small sword is a complex one, and I think it really comes down to convenience but also fashion, and the fact that these swords were predominantly becoming only worn as a symbol of your willingness to duel to protect your honour, and they weren't being worn very much for self-defense purposes anymore, whereas in the time of the rapier you might have to fight someone who has a backsword, or you might have to, you know, you might be attacked by someone with a partisan, something like this. So I think it's a very, very different context. But the main point I want to finish off with is really a lot of people have gone, because this is a specialised duelling weapon, it's therefore superior in a duel. No, I don't agree with that. I think in a duel between someone with a small sword and a rapier, I would put my money on the rapier every time. Cheers folks! Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.